Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oregon Conservation Partnership webinar. This month's webinar is on recent changes in Oregon law that affect your nonprofit organization. My name is Anna Freitas. I am the Policy and Program Manager for the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. And my role during this webinar will be as moderator. I'll be keeping an eye out for your questions and relaying them to our presenter, David E. Atkin. This webinar is part of a series organized by the Conservation Partnership. Our primary audience is soil and water conservation districts, watershed councils, and land trusts. But if you know other people who would be interested, feel free to forward those links and share our website. The webinars are now every 2 months. Those of you who join regularly might remember they were every month. But we hope we will continue to offer the most interesting and helpful webinars to you every 2 months. All of these webinars are recorded and available on our website, conservationpartnership.org. And they are sponsored by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. We thank our funders, the Watershed Enhancement Board, for helping us bring this valuable content to you all. In a minute, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter, David E. Atkin of the Center for Nonprofit Law. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. First, the audience is muted by default, but there are a couple of ways you can interact. Throughout the webinar, you can type your questions into the question box, and I will relay those questions to David when he is able to stop at a convenient pausing place in his presentation. At the end of the webinar, if you want to say something or ask a question that we can all hear, you can click the little hand icon to raise your hand, and I will unmute you. Be sure to tell everyone who you are and what organization you're with, because they like to know. Some of their colleagues are asking the same questions and joining these webinars. There is one handout for the presentation today that you can download now or throughout the presentation. That handout will also be posted with the recording on the Conservation Partnership website. Finally, there is a short survey at the end of the presentation today to ask for your feedback. We would really appreciate if you could respond to that at your convenience. It really helps us learn what's helpful for you, continue to improve these webinars and offer you valuable content, and to communicate to our funders that this is a valuable resource for you all to put conservation on the ground efficiently and effectively. Okay, with that, our presenter today is David E. Atkin, Director and Attorney of the Center for Nonprofit Law, and he will be presenting on recent changes in Oregon law that affect your nonprofit organization. David, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, okay. So as Anna said, my name is David Atkin. I'm the Senior Attorney here at the Center for Nonprofit Law. Just a quick introduction. We are the only full-time law firm in Oregon that works just exclusively for nonprofit organizations. We've been doing that for over 30 years, and we are literally the go-to law office for over 1,000 nonprofit organizations all over the state, all over the country, and working all over the world. With that in mind, I have worked with many of Oregon's watershed councils, soil conservation districts, and other agencies involved with them and involved with conservation work in Oregon, and it's always a pleasure to get to do so. The topic today, changes to the Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Act. I want to emphasize that some of these changes could affect the way that you operate, the way you make decisions, the way you select your directors, the way your voting members operate, and could lead to changes in your articles or bylaws if you chose to make some of those changes. Okay, just a little bit of history. Oregon, like all the other states, has long had an Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Act. They were a wide range of differences between them all over the country. And way back in 1989, a National Uniform Model Nonprofit Corporation Act was developed, and the majority of the states went out to adopt it, Oregon included back then. And it was a big sea change in Oregon's Nonprofit Corporation Act. And there's been a few amendments and revisions rounds for the National Uniform Model. Oregon, however, decided to go forward with changes on its own that would update and improve the national model, and is now, in my opinion, having read many of the statutes around the country for nonprofit corporations, Oregon is a leader with one of the best statutes, most favorable, clear, updated of any state in the union. We formed a committee of about 10 of us 4 years ago to start working on amendments and revisions to this statute. A small group of people that included representatives from the Department of Justice, from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, experts and practitioners in the field of nonprofit law. And as these things go, as you know, after many meetings, and then endless meetings with legislators and at the legislature, finally in the fall, these amendments were passed by the Oregon legislature, and they became effective January 1, 2020. So we're looking at 16 days ago, these changes took effect. I'm going to kind of run through the main amendments that would affect your organizations, and I'm really happy to answer questions as we go along. We don't need to wait till the very end, so I'll be pausing for questions here and there throughout, and Anna will be helping me make sure we get what questions you want to ask. Okay. First thing is that was improved was greater clarity in the ways that directors on the board of directors can be selected, appointed, designated than we had previously. There's 5 different ways that members of a board of directors can be selected, and the 2 most common ones are organizations with voting members, where the voting members get together at least once a year and they have a vote and they elect the members of the board. And generally speaking, whoever has the power to appoint or elect directors, that is the same person, entity, or body that has the power to remove them. So for organizations with voting members, the election by voting members is done at usually once a year at the annual meeting of the membership. The second method of selecting directors, and the one that's most common in the 501c3 world, is to have self-electing boards, where members of the board of directors do the election of themselves, re-electing themselves within term limits and all of that, and electing any new members of the board. In the mutual benefit world, trade associations, recreational, hobby, and interest groups, it's almost always the case that there are voting members, but in the 501c3 world, more often than not, there aren't voting members. But the rules for the election of director allow either way, and you simply have to specify in your articles and bylaws. The third way that was less common and less clear in the old statute is directors who serve with through the power of appointment. And this is a way that organizations create institutionalized links and liaisons between them. So power of appointment is when the bylaws or articles give some other organization or agency the power to appoint one or more of the members of your board of directors, and sometimes vice versa, so that there's always a representative on each board who's on both boards, and maybe more than one. So power of appointment. With the voting members election and a self-electing board and the power of appointment, the term of office is a maximum of 5 years, meaning that you can elect people with voting members or a self-electing board. You can elect them for terms of office of 1 year, meaning every year they get re-elected, 2 years, 3 years, staggered terms. But the maximum length of time that they can serve on the board is up to 5 years without being re-elected. So it's not a term limit. It's just saying that they have to be re-elected to be continue to be serving on the board. The next method for selecting directors does not have that limit on how long they serve, and that would be the ex officio directors. Ex officio directors serve by virtue of the office that they're in. So for example, if you had, for instance, a Oregon network of Oregon watershed councils, you could say that the members, the executive directors of the watershed councils who are part of the network are ex officio members of the board of directors of the Oregon network. And they serve for as long as they are the executive director of one of the watershed council members without a term limit. And when they move on, resign or fired, retire, whatever it is, when they're no longer the executive director, then automatically they're no longer on the board when it's an ex officio position. Now, there's a little bit of confusion out there in the world about ex officio as a term. Sometimes people think that if you have an ex officio director, what that means is something like an honorary director, that they don't have full voting rights. They're there on the board as a honored guest or visitor. And that's not actually accurate. Ex officio just refers to the way that they got to the board. They're still a full voting board member in every way. And if you care about Robert's rules and look at that, that confirms it as well. An ex officio director is a full voting member of the board. But I always like to make sure the bylaws state clearly, because of the confusion that some people have around this, if there's an ex officio position or more on the board, that it states ex officio with full voting rights, so that it's really clear. The fifth and final way that members of the board can be selected is designated directors. Again, less common, but nonetheless an important way for some kinds of organizations, and that is you can name a person in the articles or bylaws to be a designated director. And what that means is they also serve with no limit and no need to be reelected. So they are on the board as a designated director for as long as they choose to remain and can perform the duties of a director. So either they resign or they become ill, unable to function, age out, disabled or dead, and that's how a designated director leaves the board. The only way to remove them is to actually have an amendment to the articles or bylaws that changes that. So it's a different process for removal for a designated director. So those are the 5 ways that members of the board can be selected, and many organizations mix and match. So they'll have some members of the board who are elected by the voting members, and then those persons have the power to elect 2 or 3 more and maybe set a limit on how many directors then the board can choose to add people to the board with special skills or experience or connections that the board thinks are valuable for the organization. So you can mix and match those. You can also have a person or 2 on that same board who's there by power of appointment, perhaps appointed by a local soil and water conservation district, appointed by an agency, appointed by the county commissioners, whatever you choose to have as the power of appointment, and then ex officio. So you can have an organization with all of these mixed in as well, and the new law clarifies those ways that members of the board can be selected. I'm going to take a quick pause here and see, are there any questions at all anyone would like to ask about this topic before I move on? Okay. Anna, I think that means no questions at this point?
Yeah, I waited a moment to see if there were any last minute questions, but still none, so go ahead.
Great, okay. So next thing is there was a significant change in the way that boards can use email to vote. Now, forever, corporate law has allowed boards of directors of both nonprofits and for-profit corporations to make decisions without meetings. It's often in a section called actions without meetings. And it says basically any decision that can be made at a meeting can be made without a meeting if a consent is signed by all of the directors in office, meaning it's 100% quorum. Everyone has to vote, and everyone has to vote yes if all the directors sign their consent. That was not used very often in the past before it became possible to communicate via email, because it was laborious to type out, copy, mail out motions to everybody on the board. They'd have to take them out, read them, sign them, put them back in the mail, address the envelope, send them back in. We didn't see much of it, but when email became possible, suddenly it was really quick and easy to take votes by email. And the question became, what's the requirement there? And the law says, well, that's still in writing. It's not a real-time meeting where people can hear and discuss each other's concerns. And so the legislature passed an amendment some years back saying electronic voting by email is allowed as a form of action without a meeting, as a form of making decisions in writing, but we're still going to follow the rules that it takes 100% quorum and 100% agreement So if one director were to say, I'm not comfortable with this without a meeting, or abstain, or they vote no, it didn't pass. Or one director is just on vacation and didn't check their email, it doesn't pass until every director votes yes. The concern was that big decisions would be made without adequate discussion and communication about it. What we know now after several decades of experience with email voting is that people do discuss it, and even directors who are very quiet during meetings may write you several pages about their thoughts and concerns by email, and real discussions back and forth does take place. With that in mind, the law was changed to say that you can pass a motion by an email vote, but with the affirmative vote of a majority of the directors in office. As soon, if there are 9 directors, as soon as 5 of them vote yes, it passes. You don't have to wait for all the rest of them to weigh in. Even it passes when that majority of all the directors in office have voted and voted yes. So it's going to be a lot easier to make motions and make decisions by email. The law has some requirements for doing that, and the handout that I presented actually includes a model provision for your bylaws. So what the law says is that unless your articles or bylaws say otherwise, then voting by email may be authorized by the board, and if it is authorized by the board, it requires that the corporation has an email address for every director. If there's one director on the board that says, sorry, I'm a Luddite, I don't do computers, then you can't do it. So you have to have an email address provided by every board member, and then you have to keep a record of these of the announcement that goes out saying we're going to have a vote by email and here's the motion, and a record of how each director voted. With that in mind then, the rules are that you send it out and you have to state a deadline, which may not be less than 48 hours. So everyone has at least 48 hours to see the email and read it before the deadline for voting is reached. So you can say, you know, here's the motion. We'll give everybody a week until such and such a date to discuss it, but make sure you have voted yes, no, or I abstain by the end of that period. The people who are on the board can change their votes all the way up until that deadline occurs, so they can vote early and then hear other people's concerns and change their vote in response to that. And again, the votes have to be saved as a form of minutes, so they can be put into the minutes of a subsequent meeting, or they can just be printed out and saved on their own in the corporate minutes book. Either way is going to be just fine. In addition to the changes in email voting, some other changes were making it clear directors cannot allow someone else to vote for them by proxy. The law was not clear about that before, and now it's been clarified to say directors can send in their opinions if there's going to be a meeting, but they can't vote by proxy. And if it's a real-time meeting, you can't mix the two. There's the rules for meeting in person, and if a member of the board is available to participate remotely by Skype, Zoom, video conference, cell phone on speakerphone, whatever it is, if a director is participating remotely and they can be heard simultaneously by all the other participating directors, legally they're deemed as present for the meeting, present in the room for quorum and voting. And so the rules are for meetings in person, that it takes, unless your articles or bylaws say otherwise, it takes the majority of the directors at the meeting, if there's a quorum present, to pass a motion. Now, your bylaws can make it greater than that, but that's certainly the most common, is a majority of the directors present. What you cannot do is you cannot mix the two methods of voting, either by email or voting by in person. You can't mix the two and say, well, we had a meeting, we had almost a quorum, and then can we get one person to vote by email and then count that as the quorum and it passes? And the answer is no. It's either an email vote, we follow those rules, or it's an in-person meeting vote, we follow those rules. We can't mix and hybridize and count email votes to make up the difference for voting in person. Okay, so voting by email has just gotten much easier to do and much easier to pass. I'm going to pause now to ask, are there any questions about any of that before I move on to the next topic?
Catherine has a question. What if we have alternatives for our board members? For instance, we have a state representative that sends someone on his behalf for times he can't be available.
Yes, good question. And I've seen that kind of a structure in a number of different organizations over the years, and here's the answer. The law contemplates that when you're a member of the board of directors, you have your 3 legal duties: your duty of diligence, duty of loyalty, duty of compliance with the law. You have your responsibilities as members of the board to stay engaged, know what's involved, come to meetings and all. And someone who is on the board is a member of the board, whether or not they're at that meeting. And there's no provision for people who are sometimes directors, but sometimes not directors, depending on if the primary person who is a director showed up. A person's either, it's an all or nothing kind of thing. You're either a member of the board of directors or you're not. So you can't have alternate directors who come to a meeting and vote as if they're on the board, or vote by proxy, not allowed also, as if they're on the board, only at specific times. They certainly can be an alternate for purposes of representing one of the constituencies, one of the organizations that are members. For communication, you can have alternates in your bylaws there to speak on behalf of the organization, participate, to listen, but not to vote. They're either on the board or not. And the only way to change that is if you, say, for instance, have an organization with representatives from different organizations or constituencies. So you can say that the body that appointed that director can remove them and appoint someone else in advance of a meeting, so that they effectively change who the director is for that meeting, so that that person is properly elected or properly appointed and then can vote. But you can't simply have a provision that says if the main representative from an organization is not available, then there's an alternate director who can vote for them. That would not be allowed. Good question. Thank you for asking that. Anna, any other questions before I go to the next topic?
I wanted to clarify a little bit first. So you said that the board member can appoint someone for that meeting, so they can temporarily remove themselves and then appoint someone else. Is that what you...
Yes, if a board member can't come to a meeting, they can ask someone to go to the meeting, to take notes for them, to represent them but not vote for them. And if the person who's not present was appointed by another organization, say you've got an organization like the Oregon Network of Waters and Councils, and you've got people who have been appointed by the member councils, you can name someone automatically to be the alternate for purposes of representation, but not for purposes of voting, unless they formally remove the director or the ordinary director and then formally appoint a new person to be there in their place.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
There are a couple more questions. Sorry. If one board member calls in to an in-person meeting, can that person still vote?
Yes, the law says that if a person participates in a meeting by any electronic or telephonic method that allows them to be simultaneously heard by the other participating directors, then they are deemed legally present at that meeting for quorum and voting. So it can be as simple as you call a meeting and one person's home with a sick kid and you get them on your speaker, on your cell phone, put it on speaker, put it on the table, and everybody can hear their voice, then they're deemed present for the meeting. They can be there by Skype, Zoom, you can do a conference call. Any method by which they can be heard by everybody else at the meeting makes them legally present and able to vote.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question about email voting. To clarify, we can use email voting during the board meeting, but email votes cannot be added after the meeting concludes.
That's not quite right. If it's a actual meeting, whether it's by phone, conference call, Skype, Zoom, whatever it is, or in person in the room, no director can vote by email and have that vote counted at an actual meeting. You can say, you can have a meeting at which a quorum isn't present, and then you can say, uh-oh, we can't really make decisions at this meeting, there's no quorum, so we're going to turn this into a vote. I'm going to send out an email right now to everybody, and everybody has 48 hours to respond by email. So you can switch from a meeting in person to an email vote. Give the 48 hours at least minimum for people to respond. But you can't have a vote that is done partially by email and partially by people present at the meeting. Other questions?
Can an alternate director be assigned to each representative seat formally in the bylaws?
Yes, absolutely. You can do that. You can say, for instance, the executive directors are ex officio members of the board of directors of an alliance or networked organization. And then you can say if the executive director is unable to attend a meeting, then the president or secretary of the board of that member council can be their alternates. But unless they are, unless you remove a director or have the power to additionally appoint someone to be a director, saying that they're an alternate doesn't give them the power to vote unless they're properly appointed or elected by whoever has the power to do that. So yes, the bylaws can say these are our alternates for purposes of representation if the director from our organization is unable to attend. But in order for them to vote, they have to be individually, depending on what your articles or bylaws say, have to be individually elected or appointed. And again, the reason for that is just the concern to make sure that people who are on the board know they're on the board full time, whether they're in a meeting or not. They still have their legal duties of diligence and loyalty and compliance with the law. They're on the hot seat. And they don't get off that easily just because they couldn't make it to a meeting. They still have those duties, and someone else doesn't take on those duties without being properly elected or selected.
This is apparently a very important issue to our audience. There's another question basically asking for clarification about how this is specified in the law. So this audience member says they're aware of an organization a large organization that uses alternate directors. Is it clearly specified in the law that this is not allowed, or is this interpretation?
Good question. It is an interpretation shared by all of the nonprofit regulatory bodies, the Department of Justice, the Oregon Corporation Division, by all the people who practice law in this area. The law does not specifically say you may not have alternate directors. The law says these are how a director must be appointed or selected, and a person who is named as a provisional alternate is not selected through one of the procedures the law allows. And so just saying if Sally is the regular director from that organization, she can't make it to this meeting, we're going to send someone else instead. That's not using one of the allowable legal methods by which a director can be chosen. They have to either have a formal appointment, a formal election, be there as an ex officio, or some other way to get them to have the power to vote. And the reason the law is so clear about that is if you have people who are named to the board of directors improperly and they're counted for quorum, then everything that happened at that meeting is not valid and can be voided. If they're counted for, if there's a quorum present, even without them, and they vote on a matter and their vote makes the difference in whether it passed or not, well, if they weren't properly elected, if they weren't properly appointed formally and in writing, then their vote that helped pass a motion was invalid, and so that motion and anything that is a consequence of it, contracts being signed, money being spent, that motion was improperly passed and is void. So if you have people who are coming as alternates who aren't properly elected by one of the ways the law allows, then it creates a vulnerability for all the decisions the board makes anytime there's an alternate who has cast a vote. Anna, any other questions on that?
Let me double check that I didn't miss anything. I think we covered that even if it's an agency and that agency has a designated seat, the individual is the board member, not the agency.
That is correct. The law requires that board members must be individual persons and not entities, agencies, organizations. And so the entity either has an ex officio person who serves on the board, and I deal with some situations where the ex officio board members are the county commissioners or the head of the human resources department or human services department. So agencies can have either power of appointment or ex officio people serving on the board. But it's always the person who's a board member, not the agency or organization that chooses them.
Okay, great. I think that covers all the questions for now. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. A number of other changes took place in the law. One of them clarifying that when there are, even further clarifying that when there are regular meetings for which a schedule has been announced, that you do not have to keep giving new notice for regular meetings that take place, like on the second Tuesday of every month at 5 o'clock. And it's, where the meeting is, or it's by Skype or Zoom. Once you've given notice of your schedule of regular meetings, the law makes it clear that you do not have to keep giving notice of meetings in order to hold the meeting. You certainly may send out reminders and decide to do so, but the big deal is if you have a special meeting and you didn't give notice in the proper amount of time to all of the directors, then that meeting is invalid, can't take place, or at least decisions made at a meeting without proper notice can be invalidated by anyone that didn't receive the notice. So the issue here is with regular meetings, no one can say the meeting is invalid because they didn't get a special notice if it's a regular meeting. You'll be happy to know, I'm sure, that another good clarification in the law is, yes, the Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Act and many others still allowed notice by a variety of means, including mail, in person, and by telegraph and teletype. And I don't know about you, but it's been a long time since I've received notice by telegraph or teletype. And we finally, in fact, got that out of the law and added electronic notice instead. So notice can be sent out by a variety of electronic means. Okay, next topic a little bit here is for organizations with executive committees. We clearly distinguish committees into two different types. There's either board level committees with the power to make board level decisions, such as budgetary decisions, program decisions, board level decisions on contracts, things like that, and then all the rest. All the rest would be committees that are working committees carrying out decisions of the board, nominating committees, fundraising committees, budget committees that make recommendations to the board. Basically, all the other committees except executive committees are recommending or committees or working committees. But with board level committees, where the board actually creates a committee and delegates these powers to it, we've clarified the law to even further to make sure it says clearly that only voting board members can serve on a board level committee, an executive committee of the board, because only board members have the power to make board level decisions. So for instance, your paid executive director would not usually be a voting member of your board. Best practice is that's too big a conflict of interest to have a paid executive director serving on the board that chooses them, sets their compensation, sets the benefits for them, et cetera, et cetera. So if the executive director is attending the executive committees, that's fine. They're probably the right person and they should be attending all or most of the executive committee meetings. But if they're not a voting board member, they can't vote on the executive committee. So the law clarifies that, and then clarifies that if your bylaws say the officers shall be the members of the executive committee, that's great, it's automatic. But otherwise, to add anyone else to the executive committee, other than what's stated in your bylaws, it takes a majority of all the directors in office voting yes to approve giving that person a slot on the executive committee. Okay. Next is conflicts of interest. The law in Oregon has always required that conflict of interest transactions must be approved in a certain way. The IRS puts out a 5-page policy for how conflicts of interest must be handled, and they publish it and make it available. And then they ask you again and again every year on your 990s, have you adopted a conflict of interest policy that substantially complies with the IRS policy that we publish? And of course, the answer they want to hear is yes. And it sets up a 5-step process. beginning with conflicts of interest must be approved by the board at the board level, not by the president or the executive director. Conflicts of interest, when they arise, have to be declared, disclosed, why it's a conflict, what is the transaction, paying someone who's on the board or paying their related parties. And then it goes on into the board's duty to determine that it's a fair and reasonable, it's an ethical transaction based on fair market values, no insiders getting excess benefits. Well, the IRS policy states that your related parties for conflicts of interest are your immediate family and relatives. So you, your parents and grandparents, your kids and grandchildren, your siblings, and the spouses or spouse equivalents of all those people. So for instance, one could say the IRS thinks you're not so in love with your nieces, your nephews, your aunts or your uncles that you're going to give them some great insider corrupt deal. So they're not requiring declaring and disclosing for those people. Oregon decided to cast a broader net in the interest of transparency and ethics. So Oregon clarified its statute on conflicts of interest in two ways. One, it said a director has an indirect interest, a conflict of interest, if a transaction with the organization involves a person related to that director, related to a director. So that casts a pretty broad net, related to a director, and you could ask the question very validly. Well, ultimately, aren't we all related? How far out do we go? Am I looking at second cousins, third cousins, people who are distantly related? And what happens if I don't know that they're engaged in a transaction with this organization? And the answer is that when a director is aware of it, and you have a duty, to pay attention, your duty of diligence to pay attention and know what's going on. And so if a director is aware that someone related to them is involved in a financial transaction with their nonprofit, then they have that duty to declare, disclose, abstain from voting on it. The board follows the 5-step process. So we've cast a wider net than the IRS policy requires in this new law. The other clarification is that when you follow the 5-step process for approving a conflict of interest, you create a presumption that it was fair and reasonable to the organization, that it's ethical, but it is not a safe harbor, meaning that if the board follow these 5 steps, to declare, disclose, abstain, looking at other information to determine is it a reasonable, fair, ethical transaction, they decide that it is. The voting requirement is an unusual vote. It requires the affirmative vote of a majority of all the directors in office who are disinterested directors. They have no conflict. So a majority of all the disinterested directors have to say yes, vote yes, to allow a conflict of interest transaction to take place. So these are the rules for doing it. And the law clarification says, okay, if you follow those rules, you create a presumption of fairness, but not a safe harbor. If you approved a corrupt excess benefit transaction, as the IRS calls it, you gave an insider way too much benefit in that transaction, it's still a violation of the law to do so, and the fact that you followed the process doesn't give you a safe harbor. Okay, I'm going to pause for any questions on either executive committee or conflicts of interest or anything else.
No new questions, so go ahead.
Okay. The next change is, interestingly enough, the law has always had a clear statement of what the rights of members were in terms of the rights of members to inspect all kinds of records, see the minutes, see financial materials, different things like that. The members must be given the right to contact each other and contact information so they can talk amongst themselves about who to elect or remove from the board. But the law has never been clear about what are the inspection rights of directors. And that's led to some serious disagreements about, well, if the board wants to see a deeper look at the financial records, if the board wants to have a look at communications between the organization and others, do directors individually have the right to require that? And this omission in the previous law has been fixed. The new law gives a very specific list of the inspection rights of members of the board of directors, of the directors for the organization, and giving them clear rights to request and the right to receive appropriate financial records and communications, lists of the contact information for the voting members themselves, all of the minutes of the organization for all of the meetings, financial statements, all these different things. And so clarifying, in order to do their job, directors have to have, their job of being oversight for the organization, a check and balance for the staff. They have to have the right to review these kinds of documents and information, and the updates in the law clearly says that for the first time. Okay, another change, officers. Interestingly enough, there has never been a federal requirement, an IRS regulation, or a state law that requires you to have anything more than a president and a secretary, meaning treasurers were not required, in spite of the fact that the IRS and the Department of Justice are putting more and more pressure on boards to be, they're involved in the financial control environment to make sure your financial controls prevent your money from being stolen, that you're financially prudent. And so and usually the treasurer is the person who's the point person for those kinds of things, making sure financial reports are available, that someone's monitoring your financial control system, etc. But there's never been a requirement that there must be a treasurer. And this new law changes that from what has always been a best practice, yes, there should be a treasurer as a best practice, and changed it into an actual legal requirement. So whether or not your bylaws say there must be a treasurer, the law says that for you now. And so even if your bylaws say there shall be a president and a secretary, and the offices of treasurer and vice president are optional, the law sets this as a change that supersedes your own bylaws. Another change in the law that could affect some of these organizations is the definition of a voting member. For a very long time, the definition of voting member was simple and clear and unitary. It was a voting member is any person who has the power to vote, the right to vote on the election of one or more members of your board of directors. If they have the power to elect board members, one or more of the board members, then they are a voting member. And a lot of organizations have members with other kinds of rights. And so we changed the law on this with our committee came up with a much broader definition of who can be a voting member. That includes people who have the right to elect directors, people who have the right to just remove directors, people who have the right to vote on the change in the number of directors, people who have the right to vote on such things as the sale of the corporation's assets, or to merge, or vote to dissolve, or to vote on the amendments to the articles or bylaws. All of those different powers can be given in combinations or just one of those powers, and it creates someone who is a voting member, and then they have the rights of voting members. If you have a voting member under any of those definitions, the two things that they must have is they must have the right to vote. Voting members are the only body that has the right to vote on changes in their own powers, so that the board can't, for instance, amend the bylaws and articles to take out voting members or change their voting rights. Only the voting members themselves can change or diminish or eliminate their rights to vote. And the second is, you can't remove a voting member's right to inspect the documents, certain list of documents and records of the organization. So if you have voting members under any of those definitions now, they have to have the right to inspect documents, and they're the only ones who can reduce their rights. But now you can have voting members for very specific purposes. And of course, as always, you can have people in your organization who you call your members, who are dues-paying supporters but have no voting rights at all. So I generally, when I'm writing bylaws and reviewing them, recommend that you very clearly distinguish between regular members, dues-paying members, supporting members, whatever you want to call them, your general members, and your voting members who have actual, clear, specific legal rights. Okay, another change in the law for groups that do have voting members who pay dues is that in the past there's a requirement that to remove someone from a voting membership position, to remove a voting member, you have to follow a practice and procedure that is deemed fair and reasonable. Fair and reasonable is defined to include at least a written notice to someone who you're going to remove 15 days before the removal, and the chance to respond orally or in writing at least 5 days in advance of the date of their removal and respond to whatever body or person has the power to decide whether the removal takes place. Given the philosophy that if you have voting members, ultimately they control the organization. They elect the board generally, is at least the old definition and the usual one. And by doing so, they're supposed to be the ultimate source of authority. And so removing voting members is something that needs to be done very carefully. The law continues that, however, it does say, in addition, that if your voting members are required to pay dues, if they fail to pay the dues, then they are automatically removed, and you don't have to follow this procedure and process to remove a voting member who has failed to pay the required dues on time. So this was a problem with the previous law that said this was the only method to remove them, was the much more elaborate procedure, and now they can be removed for paying dues. Another change in the law for this would be that generally when the voting members elect a board member, only the voting members can remove them, except if there are causes, specific causes stated in your bylaws for the board to remove a director, then the board can remove a director who was elected by the members for that specific cause. So the default is if both voting members elect them, they always have the right to remove them, but the board can only do so for a specific cause. And the law was clarified to say the bylaws can say now that a member of the board of directors can be removed by the board for failing to attend a certain number of meetings, for being absent a certain number of meetings per quarter, per year, certain 3 meetings in a row, or 3 meetings without advance notice to the president or secretary, that you can give the board the power to remove a director for failing to attend meetings by stating that in your bylaws. So another change there that could have a reflection in how your bylaws look. The final change here I wanted to note just in passing is that the law was updated to clarify that anytime there are records required to be made or kept, they always includes keeping, making records electronically, storing them electronically, having your corporate minutes stored electronically. That the words records and documents includes now in all cases electronic versions of those documents. And with that as well, a change used to be required that you must give the state the address of all of your directors. And with some concerns about privacy and safety and otherwise, we amended that to say that the address you can give to the state includes both a physical address, a mailing address, or an electronic address. So now you can list and give information to the state about the address of your directors wherever it's required as an electronic address to protect their privacy as well. Okay, I'm going to pause now for any questions about that.
We have a few questions about, excuse me, recovering from cold, about the requirement to have a secretary and treasurer. So first, is the legislature now mandating that nonprofit organizations must have a treasurer?
Yes, Oregon state law now requires you to have a treasurer. Now, some organizations have a practice of having someone who serves as the secretary treasurer, both. I always like to write it into the bylaws as 2 separate positions so that you have the option of someone who is only the treasurer and another person who's only the secretary, but there's nothing to prevent you from electing a person to be both of those positions. The law does say that you can't have the same person serving in all 3 positions. That's going to require there are at least 2 officers, maybe a president and a secretary treasurer. But again, it's best to write it in your bylaws so that the treasurer is a separate position, even if you choose to elect one person to be both the secretary and treasurer. And it is now, for the first time, a legal requirement.
Could the secretary be a paid staff person of the organization?
Good question. And the answer is yes. It is a conflict of interest to have a director or officer who is paid by the organization. And so it would have to be treated as a conflict of interest and following that 5-step procedure to do so. Generally the only time I see that usually would be that sometimes the executive director, the paid executive director of an organization, for convenience, will serve as the corporate secretary, making sure notices go out, minutes are made, minutes are adopted. They're able as a secretary to sign documents, returns, and forms for the IRS. So for convenience, we do see sometimes the executive director being the corporate secretary. On the other hand, The best practice is you really shouldn't have a paid staff person being the president of your organization. The president kind of is the leader of the board and speaks for the board, should be having a robust conversation with the executive director, who's the leader of the staff, and speaks from the staff perspective. You want the president and the executive director to be speaking to each other. You really shouldn't have a situation in which one person is both of those. Similarly, given the role of the board in being a check and balance for financial accountability and financial controls, it's better if you have a board member who serves as the treasurer. That doesn't mean they're the bookkeeper. It doesn't mean that they're the accountant, but that they're the treasurer of the organization. And it's better if they're not a paid staff person, because in that sense, you diminish the separation of functions and the financial controls to have a staff person also be the treasurer, who is responsible for kind of overseeing how the staff uses the money that the board has authorized. So the answer is yes, you can have a paid staff person be an officer, but generally best practice is limit it to being the corporate secretary.
General question, is it fair to say that most of the changes in the law are addressing weaknesses, silences in most cases, and are much less about addressing significant, egregious operational issues with Oregon nonprofits?
I would say that is correct. This was intended to be an improvement and an updating that did not address controversial issues. There were a number of provisions we considered that would have brought substantial changes in the way nonprofits operate, and we opted, in order to get this through the legislature and make these improvements available, to choose improvements that were fairly non-controversial, that most people would agree these are needed, these are better than the old way, and no controversial or significant changes were made affecting the powers and rights of nonprofits.
Okay, those are all the questions for now. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's the end of my summary of the changes in the Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Act. If anybody has other questions they want to direct to me later, that would be just fine. I think Anna has my contact information. Good luck to all of you, and thank you for being part of this webinar today, and thank you for serving on your boards and districts. It's a service to all of us, and we appreciate it.
Great, thank you for joining us today, all of our audience members, and thank you for providing this really important update to everyone, David. Again, this was the Oregon Conservation Partnership webinar. The next webinar will be not in February, but in March, every 2 months. So in March, tune back in with us. There is a brief survey that you'll get a little pop-up when I close the webinar, where you can provide feedback and a little bit of information that will help us continue to provide valuable content to you all. You can also contact me or other Conservation Partnership staff people if you have questions or suggestions about these webinars. And thank you, of course, to our sponsors at the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and that I'll see you all in a couple of months on the next webinar. Thank you. I am now closing the webinar.